Overview of the CSDDD. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, aims to ensure that companies contribute to sustainable development by addressing human rights and environmental impacts. It establishes obligations for companies to integrate due diligence into their operations and supply chains. The directive also outlines the responsibilities of companies in preventing, mitigating, and remediating adverse impacts. Background and context. The CSDDD is rooted in the EU's commitment to human rights, environmental protection, and sustainable development. It aligns with international frameworks such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. The directive responds to the need for a unified approach across the EU to address global value chain challenges. Key objectives of the directive. The directive's primary objectives are to foster sustainable economic, social, and environmental development, ensure fair working conditions, and promote decent work worldwide. It seeks to enhance corporate accountability and transparency in addressing human rights and environmental risks. Additionally, it aims to harmonize due diligence practices across the EU to prevent market fragmentation. Scope of application. The CSDDD applies to large companies operating within the EU, including those from third countries with significant operations in the EU. It sets thresholds based on employee numbers and turnover to determine applicability. The directive also covers companies engaged in franchising or licensing agreements that meet specific financial criteria. Definitions and key terms. Key terms defined in the directive include adverse human rights impact, adverse environmental impact, and chain of activities. These definitions guide companies in identifying and addressing potential and actual impacts. The directive also clarifies the roles of subsidiaries, business partners, and stakeholders in the due diligence process. Due diligence requirements. Companies are required to conduct risk-based due diligence to identify, assess, and address adverse impacts. This involves integrating due diligence into policies, identifying risks, and implementing measures to prevent and mitigate impacts. Companies must also provide remediation for actual impacts and engage with stakeholders throughout the process. Integrating due diligence into policies. To ensure effective due diligence, companies must integrate it into their policies and risk management systems. This includes developing a due diligence policy, a code of conduct, and processes for implementation. The policy should be updated regularly to reflect changes in operations and identified risks. Identifying and assessing adverse impacts. Companies must identify and assess actual and potential adverse impacts in their operations and supply chains. This involves mapping operations, conducting in-depth assessments, and considering relevant risk factors. The process should be dynamic, with regular updates to reflect new risks and changes in the business environment. Preventing and mitigating adverse impacts. Preventing and mitigating adverse impacts requires companies to take appropriate measures, such as developing prevention action plans and seeking contractual assurances from business partners. Companies should prioritize engagement with partners to address impacts, using leverage and collaboration where necessary. Remediation and stakeholder engagement. Remediation involves restoring affected individuals or environments to their prior state. Companies must engage meaningfully with stakeholders, providing information and consulting on potential impacts. This engagement should be ongoing and inclusive, taking into account barriers and vulnerabilities. Monitoring and reporting obligations. Companies must monitor the effectiveness of their due diligence measures and report on their activities. This includes periodic assessments and public communication of due diligence efforts. Reporting should align with existing EU sustainability reporting requirements to avoid duplication. Combating climate change. The directive requires companies to adopt transition plans for climate change mitigation, aiming for alignment with the Paris Agreement. These plans should include targets and actions for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Companies must update these plans regularly to reflect progress and changes. Role of supervisory authorities. Supervisory authorities are designated to oversee compliance with the directive. They have the power to investigate, enforce penalties, and ensure companies meet their obligations. Authorities must operate independently and transparently, providing guidance and support to companies. Penalties and enforcement penalties for non-compliance include pecuniary fines and public statements. Penalties are determined based on the severity and duration of the infringement, among other factors. The directive ensures penalties are effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. Civil liability and compensation. The directive establishes civil liability for companies that fail to prevent or mitigate adverse impacts. Victims of such impacts have the right to seek compensation. The directive also addresses procedural barriers to justice, ensuring access to evidence and affordable legal proceedings. Support for SMEs and stakeholders. The directive acknowledges the impact on SMEs and provides for support measures. Member states in the EU may offer financial assistance and capacity building to help SMEs comply with due diligence requirements. Stakeholders are also supported through information and engagement initiatives. Guidelines and model clauses. Guidelines and model contractual clauses are provided to assist companies in implementing due diligence. These resources offer practical tools and best practices for compliance. The directive encourages collaboration through industry and multi-stakeholder initiatives. International cooperation and impact. The directive emphasizes international cooperation to address global value chain challenges. It aligns with international standards and encourages engagement with third countries. The directive also considers the impact of international agreements on its provisions. Future developments and amendments. Future developments may include amendments to the directive based on its effectiveness and evolving international standards. The directive includes provisions for periodic review and reporting to ensure it remains relevant and impactful. Conclusion and key takeaways. In conclusion, the CSDDD represents a significant step towards sustainable corporate governance. It establishes clear obligations for companies to address human rights and environmental impacts. The directive aims to harmonize practices across the EU, fostering a fair and sustainable market environment.